Today's daf is Menachos daf Pei Zayin, and we are at the Mishnah on the bottom of daf Pei Vav Amud Beis. It's like the Mishnah, Me'ayin Hayu Meviin Es Hayayin. From where would the Gizbar take the wine that was going to be used in the Beis HaMikdash? So the Nesachim involved wine. The question is, where did that wine come from? Kidduchim, Ve'atulin, these were places, Alfaliyai, that produced the best wine in Eretz Yisrael. So the Katchila, that's where the wine would come from. Shniya Lehem, second best, is Beis Rima uBeis Lavan Bahar, which were both on a mountain, Ukfar Signa Babika, which was in a valley. The truth is that all lands, any wine that's produced in Eretz Yisrael was okay. However, there was a Lekatchila and a second best. Thus the Mishnah mentions those places. You're not allowed to bring wine from a vineyard that is Mi Beis Hazvalim, a fertilized field. Or from a field that relies on irrigation. Or from a field where things grow in between the vines. You're not allowed to bring wine that comes from grapes that were sweetened as a result of the fact that they sat out in the sun for an extended period of time. So if the wine comes from sweet grapes, it's not okay. You're not allowed to bring aged wine. The Chacham say it's okay. You're not allowed to bring loy masik, not sweet wine, or wine that was smoked, or mavushal wine. So you're not allowed to take wine from vines that grew on fences. So sometimes the vines will be interwoven in a fence. It's called a trellis. So you're not allowed to take wine from such a vine. You're supposed to take wine from vines that grow on the ground. They're closer to the earth. That's where you want the wine to come from. Additionally, you're supposed to take wine from a vineyard that was cultivated. We'll see in the Gemara what that means. You're not allowed to gather the wine that's going to be used in the Beis HaMikdash in large casks. Rather, you're supposed to put it in small barrels. The wine that's going to be used in the Beis HaMikdash, when you put it in the barrel, you shouldn't fill the barrel all the way up to the top. And the reason is, because if there's a little bit of space between the top of the wine and the cover of the barrel, that causes the reach, the aroma of the wine to gather in that area. Like this, when you pop open the cork, you have that smell. Additionally, when you take wine now out of this barrel, you're not supposed to take from the top part of the barrel, because mold would sometimes gather there. Nor from the bottom, because the sediment there. From the middle third, from the middle of the middle third. How exactly did you go about to make sure that you're taking from the middle third, not from the bottom? So to get rid of the top third is easy. But the question is, what about the middle? You only want the middle and not the bottom. How do you know that some of the bottom third isn't getting into what it is you're pouring to use in the Beis HaMikdash? So the Mishnah says, HaGizbar Yoshev, the Gizbar would sit, V'akana biyadai, and he had a stick in his hand. Zara Kagir, as soon as he saw a little bit of sediment leave the barrel and go into what they were pouring the wine into, Hikish Bakana, he would hit the bottom of the barrel with a stick, and like this, the person pouring would know to stop pouring. The obvious question is, why can't you just say it? Why do you have to hit it? Tomorrow's going to ask the kasha. If there's kimchen, a little bit of sediment inside the wine, it's possible. Tamimim means it has to be perfect. It says it twice. Thus, if there's going to be a little bit of these kimchen, it's going to be possible. So the Mishnah said a lot of halachas regarding the wine that was used in the Beis HaMikdash, and the Gemara is going to go through now, line by line, explaining the Mishnah. So the Mishnah had said, Ein meviin, loy masaik, v'loy mavushal, v'loy mu'ushtan. You're not allowed to bring wine that's sweet, wine that's cooked, wine that's smoked, them heavy, but the evet possible. Right, the Gemara, is that true? Yayin masuk, but the evet is possible. Vaktani Reisha, the Reisha of the Mishnah said, you're not allowed to take wine from grapes that were exposed to the sun and as a result became sweet. The imhevi and b'di evet kosher. So what's the difference between yayin halistiyoin and yayin masuk? Yayin halistiyain is wine that comes from grapes that were exposed to the sun for a very long time in a way that causes the grapes to become sweet. In other words, you have sweet wine. Yayin masik is also sweet wine. Yayin halistiyain, the Mishnah says, imhevi kosher. Yayin masik, the Mishnah says, imhevi pasal. Ravina karich batanis. Ravina says you have to edit the Mishnah. You're right, can't be. Yayin halistiyain and yayin masik is one of the same. The issue with both is the fact that they're maslik. The real girsa in the Mishnah is that yayin maslik is pasul. Thus, don't say yayin halistian is kasha, but add yayin halistian to the list of masuk and mavushal and mavushal, meaning the halachas is going to be pasul. Rav Ashi said no. Chulya the shimshalei mas, chulya the peir mas. It's true they're both sweet wine, but they're sweet for different reasons. One is sweet because it was exposed to the sun. The other one is sweet because the grape was naturally sweet. If it's halistian, it's sweet because it was exposed to the sun, but the evidence is going to be kasha. If it's yayin masuk, it's from a fruit that's naturally sweet. It's ma'os. As a result, you're not supposed to use it. So even though aged wine is usually a good thing, but when it came to the Nesachim and the Beis HaMikdash, it was a bad thing. Why? It says, La keves yayin. And this is a pasuk we're all familiar with. V'neskeim chatzi ahin yiyah lapar, u'shlishes ahin la'ayil, u'revias ahin la keves yayin, zois oilas chodesh, v'chodshei hashana. It says, La keves yayin. Ma keves, just like the keves, that's the oilas chodesh. That's the keves that was used for the carbon musaf on Rosh Chodesh. Ben Shnasai had to be a year old. Af Yayin Ben Shnasai. So it's true. It's a mila for the wine to be aged, but at the same time, there's Xeris HaKasav that the Yayin has to be like the keves. The keves had to be a Ben Shana. The wine had to be as well. Ima keves Ben Shtei Shana and Pasal Af Yayin Ben Shtei Shana Pasal. Does that mean that B'di'evet, just like if the keves is 2 years old, it's Pasal, it means that the wine that's 2 years old is going to be Pasal as well? Says the Gemara, maybe. By the time you learn to the Brayos, Yayin Ben Shtei Shana Lo Yavi, then maybe kosher. You see B'di'evet, the wine is kosher. Now, man, who's the one that says that you're not allowed to bring aged wine? Who said it in our Mishnah? Rebbe. Vika Amar Imhevi kosher. And still the Brayos says, but the evidence kosher. So what's the kasha? If the makar that aged wine is possible is because it says la keves yayin, yayin dumya de keves, then just like that teaches me that lekatchila you're not supposed to use aged wine, it should teach me that b'di'evet aged wine is going to be possible. Elam arava, hainu, taima de Rebbe. The makar to Rebbe's halach that you have to use yayin chadash dafka for the nesachim. You're not allowed to use aged wine. Is from somewhere else. The pasuk says in Mishlei, al teire yayin kiyas adam. Pasha, this is musar. Don't drink wine when it's very red because it's gonna lead to problems. But what you see from here is that wine is best when it's the most red. And wine is the most red when it's a ben shana, and it's based on that halacha is the wine that was going to be used for the nesachim. We want it to be kiyas adam, that's ben shana, that's the halacha. Nothing to do with the hekish of lakeves yoyin. Eimavian, loy men adaliyos. And then the Mishnah said, so you're supposed to take vines that are ragliyos, that are attached to the ground. Additionally, umin hakramim ha'oivdim. You're supposed to take it from a vineyard that was quote-unquote cultivated. What does that mean? Tana kramim ha'avudim pamayim b'shana. So there were vineyards that were worked once a year, and then there were vineyards that were worked twice a year. So whatever work was done in the vineyard, they would do it since Sveitin Mo. That's considered a good thing, and as a result, we want the katchila that the wine that's going to be used for the nesachim should come from such a vineyard. Rabbi Yosef Habali Karnu de Pardisa. Rabbi Yosef owned a corner lot in a pardes, the Rafik Beit Fei Rivka, and he did this. He worked it twice, va'avad chamra, and when he produced wine, Rabbi Yosef's wine was so good, it was the Dari Maya al Chad train. That wine back in the times of Chazal used to be diluted. But in terms of how much water you needed to cut this wine, to dilute it, you needed twice the amount of water, which was a good thing. Like this, you were able to preserve the wine. You had much more bang for your buck as far as using the wine goes. And it all happened because Rabbi Yosef worked the field a second time. So you see there's a milah to work the field a second time, and it plays itself out in Masechtas Menachos, the wine that's going to be used for the Nesachim, should the katchila come from such a field. The Mishnah says you're not supposed to take the wine after it's produced and put it in large casks. Rather, you're supposed to put it in barrels. Tana, what kind of barrels? Chaviyos, what does that mean? Kadiyos, ludiyos, beniyos. So you're supposed to take jugs from lud that are beniyos, the middle size. You're not supposed to put two next to each other. When you store it, it should be one, not two near each other. The reason is because if you can have two next to each other, one of them may go bad, and it's going to cause the other one to go bad. So, like this, if one goes bad, it's only going to affect itself, it won't affect the other one. If you store them in peers, then one would have an ability to affect the other. The Mishnah then said that the wine that was going to be used had to be from the middle part of the wine. You don't want to use the top part because mold gathers there. You don't want to use the bottom part because you're not supposed to have shmarim. Rabbi Yehuda said if there's kimchen, it's even possible with the evet. So what you do is you take the middle. Ketzad boydek. So the Mishnah said, how do you know that you're taking the middle? I mean, you know how to make sure it's not from the top third. But how, as you're pouring, do you know you're not taking from the bottom third? Said the Mishnah, there was a gizbar who was yoshev. He was literally watching it as the wine was pouring out. He had a stick in his hand. Zarek Hagir, if he saw a little bit of sediment leave the barrel, hikish bekana, he would hit it. Tana, zarak hagir shal shmarim, gizber hikish bekana. Freak the Gemara, v'leim alei meimar. Why does he have to hit it? Why can't he just say? Just like dibur is a good thing around besamim, kach dibur ra liyayin. So if you talk while wine is being poured, it's not a good thing. And as a result, we don't want to affect the wine even in the subtlest of ways. Thus, the gizbar wouldn't talk. He wouldn't say anything. Everybody was quiet. He would hit it with a little stick, and that was the sign that he's supposed to stop pouring. Rabbi Yehuda said that if the yayin has kimchin, the halach is it's going to be possible. Rabbi Yochanan, hikdishay mau sheyilake olav mishum balmum. If somebody is makdish this wine that has kimchin or some of the other wines that are possible, do we say that being that the wine is possible, we treat it like a balmum, and it's as if he was makdish a balmum and he's going to get malchus for that? Or not? So this is the third time we've had the shaila. Keeping the pasuk balmum dami. Thus you have the whole shulchan aruch of balmum. And the Gemara gives the same answer it gave the other two times. Teiku tana rabbanon elim. So if you're going to bring elim for the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, where should the elim come from? What's the best place? What's the alpha for elim? Mimayav, kvasim mechevroin, agolim misharoin, goizalois mehar hamelech. Rabbi Yehuda says meviin kvasim lekatchila. When the kvasim were brought, the sheep were brought for the Beis Hamikdash, there was a mila to take sheep that were gavam karachban, that their height and their width were the same. Amar Rava bar Rav Shela, my time of Rabbi Yehuda, the chsiv yireh mikna chabayei mahu kar nirchav. So we're talking about mikna nirchav. It's wide. Same width as Haiksiv, the pasuk says, Al Choy Moisayich Yerushalayim Hifkadeti Shoimrim Kol Hayoyim V'Chol Halayla. And this is a pasuk in Yeshaya Samach Beis. Tamid Lo Yechashu HaMaskirim Es Hashem Al Dami Lochem. So first of all, why are we even bringing this pasuk right now? Because we just mentioned a memra from Rava bar Rav Shela, who said, Taimid Rav Yehuda, that said it was a mila that the keves should be as wide as it is tall, is learned out from a pasuk in Yeshaya Perek Lamed. So now we have another halacha the Rava bar Rav Shela said, also from a pasuk in Yeshaya Samach Beis. And this is a pasuk that's a little better known than the previous pasuk. Al Choy Moisayich Yerushalayim Hifkadeti Shoimrim Kol Hayom V'Kol Halayla. Now, Pashup Shad, if you look at the Mefarshim in Sefer Yeshaya, Even Ezra, the Radak, the Metzudas Tava, they all say that these Shoimrim that are sitting on the Choymos Yerushalayim, Kol HaYoyim V'Chol HaLayla, Tamid Lo Yechashu, they're never quiet. Hamaskirin Es Hashem, they're reminding HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Al Domi Lochem, and they're never ever quiet. It's referring to the Avelei Tzion. These are the Yidden that mourn Yerushalayim, and they never forget about Yerushalayim. The Bachai Sifke Balayla, even in Golos, they're never forgetting Churban Beis HaMikdash. Stating that, Rava bar Rav Shela had a different shot. He understood Al Choy Moisayich Yerushalayim Hifkadeti Shoimrim, that these Shoimrim were Malachim. The pasuk is a little bit mashma that way. It sounds like a Kadosh Baruch Hu appointed these people. The Avelei Tzion are Balei Bechira. They chose themselves to mourn Yerushalayim. Al Choy Moisayich Yerushalayim Hifkadeti. I appointed Shoimrim Kol Hayoyim V'Chol Halayla. So there are Malachim, said Rava bar Rav Shela, that today in Golus are sitting by the Choymos Yerushalayim. And Tamid Lo Yechashu, they're never quiet. Hamaskirin Es Hashem, and they keep reminding Hashem. Mayamri, what are they saying? What are they reminding HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Amar Rava bar Shela, they're saying, Atos Okum Tirachim Tzion Ki Eis Lechen Akiva Moed. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Gomer, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, what they're saying is, Boine Yerushalayim Hashem, Nidche Yisrael Yichanes. Now this is what they say in Golus. Either Atos Okum Tirachim Tzion Ki Eis Lechen Akiva Moed, Yerushalayim Hashem Nidche Yisrael Yichanes. These are both psukim that are being maskir HaKadosh Baruch Hu, rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Incidentally, I saw in the In Elio, he says, Ata Sokim Terachim Tzion Ki Eis Lechenena. That's Be'ita. Ki Eis Lechenena Kiva Moed. Boine Yerushalayim Hashem Nidche Yisrael Yichanes. Boine Yerushalayim is Miloshen Hoiva. As if to say, this second build. That's Achishena. So Rava bar Rav Shela said the pasuk that they're being masked HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the pasuk of Be'ita. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said that the pasuk that they're reminding HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the pasuk of Achishena. But regardless, this is all in the time of Churban. It sounds like these malachim were there while the Beis HaMikdash stood as well. Then they weren't saying Boine Yerushalayim Hashem because there was a Beis HaMikdash. Then they weren't saying Atasachim Trachim Tzin Ke'es Lechen Akiva Moed because that Moed was there. Amar Rava bar Rav Shela, what they would say is Kivachar Hashem B'Tzion Iva L'Moshe loy hadron alach kol karbonos hatzibur. So before we go weiter, I just want to go back to the last Gemara that we learned yesterday's daf. We went through it very quickly and speak out a little bit of raid. That is, the Gemara was discussing the shemen zayis that was used for the menorah versus the shemen zayis that was used for the menachos. And the standards were different for the oil that was used for the menorah than what for the oil that was used for the menachos. And then b'derech agav, the Gemara concluded with a little bit of divrei agada, and that was the pasuk says va'ata titzave es bnei Yisrael v'yikchu elecha. Tzave es bnei Yisrael v'yikchu elecha. What does elecha mean? Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, Hakadosh Baruch Hu said elecha v'lo li. Don't think that the reason you line the menorah is for me, as if to say Hakadosh Baruch Hu dwells in the Makom HaMikdash, and Hakadosh Baruch Hu needs light. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu was incapable of providing his own light. As a result, light the menorah, and the menorah will be l'tzoyrech HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the emphasis. V'ata tetzaves b'nei Yisrael v'yikchu elecha. You're not doing it for me. You're doing it for yourself. Proof, because if I needed it, then the menorah would be next to the shulchan. The shulchan is shulchan shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Usually, you put the lights next to the table where you're reading, but the shulchan is in tzafin and the menorah is in darim. That's a raya that it's not for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Another raya from the way Shlomo HaMelech built the windows, wide, narrow. That was also a raya. The bottom line is, it's not for me, rather it's for you. What's for you? What does it mean? Why do we? What does Klal Yisrael need? The menorah, says the Gemara, it was eidos because it was eidos that the Shechina was sharing in Klal Yisrael. Well, what was the Eidos, says the Gemara? Marav and Ner Maravi, Shenoisna B'Hashem Keneged Chavriseh, Umimeno Hayamadlik Uba Hayamasayim. So the Tachlis of the menorah was really the Ner Maravi. Through the miracle of the Ner Maravi, there was Eidos li Yisrael. Really, l'chol ba'yolam shashchina shayra b'Yisrael. Thus, it's for yikchu elecha. It's not for me. It's really for Klal Yisrael. The bottom line is that the Ner Maravi was Eidos l'chol ba'yolam shashchina shayra b'Yisrael, and it was a miracle that took place every single day in the Beis HaMikdash. What bothered me is we always speak out the Mishnah in Perikei in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah discusses Asara Nisim, 10 miracles that happened. Etc., etc. And the Mishnah does not mention the Ner Maravi. So the Chura, at first glance, Sarach Bir. You have a Gemara, Menachos Daf Pei Vav Amud Beis. It's also a Gemara in Shabbos Chav Beis Amud Beis. It's something that everybody knows. We're all familiar with the Ner Maravi. The Ner Maravi was a miracle. It was such a great miracle that it was Eidos L'Chabay Yolam Shashchina Shayra B'Yisrael. If that's the case, why isn't it mentioned in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, where the Mishnah mentions the Asara Nisim that were not a fear ha'ara. The truth is, Rabbeinu Bachya in Parsha Shmini has a more extended list of the miracles that happen every day in the Beis HaMikdash. We spoke out this Rabbeinu Bachya in Perik Dam Chatas. The context over there was, if a little bit of chatas goes into a klicheres, you have to break the klicheres. So the question was, what happened to all the shards of the klicheres? And Rabbeinu Bachya brings the chazal that they were swallowed up in the ground. Figure Rabbeinu Bachya, if there was a miracle that the shards of the klicheres that were broken in the Azara were swallowed up in the ground, how come it's not Mishnah mentioned the Mishnah Pirkei Avos? Perikei Mishnah Hey Asar Nisim Nasul Aviseinu B'Beis HaMikdash, and if you go through the Mishnah, it doesn't mention that. So Rabbeinu Bachya, I'm going to be megala something to you. That Mishnah mentions 10 miracles. Really, there were 18 miracles. There's another 8 miracles, and it's true, it's not mentioned in that, but it's part of the longer list. It's part of the 18. And then Rabbeinu Bachya goes on and he mentions the 18. The 10 in the Mishnah Novice. He adds the other, and one of the other 8 that he mentions is this, the Ner Maravi, which was Eidos L'Chabay Yolam Shashchina Shayra B'Yisrael. So it's true, the Ner Maravi didn't make the cut of the top 10 that the Mishnah mentions in Pirkei Avos, but it made the second tier. It made the second list. It's on Rabbeinu Bachya's list. It's in the list of the top 18. But the truth then is, just to reformulate the question, why are there even 2 lists? Why is there a list of the 10 miracles, and then there's the list of the other 8 miracles? L'chura, they were all nisim that happened every day in the Beis HaMikdash. What would be wrong if there was only one list? The truth is, asks the Kasha, the Teis Yontif. Now, the Teis Yontif doesn't mention this Rabbeinu Bachya, doesn't talk about 18, he doesn't mention the Ner Maravi, he doesn't mention the klicheres that was swallowed up in the ground. The Teis Yontif says one line. Asara nisim nasul aviseinu b'Beis HaMikdash. Zok the Teis Yontif, the kamani lahu the leiramizu b'krakla. The Mishnah is mentioning miracles that happened la'aviseinu b'Beis HaMikdash that are not even merumas in a pasuk anywhere. In other words, Teis Yontif was bothered with this kasha. It's only 10. There's others. Now, Maravi, There are others. So why are we only mentioning 10? It says that it must be there's something unique about these 10. What's unique about these 10? What's unique is that lo remizu bikra klal. So you have to say that the ner maravi is merumas in the pasuk. Michutz l'pareichas ha'edos b'yom moed, edos u'lechabayaylam. Whatever exactly the remez is, we'll learn some of the sugyas later. But the reason it's not mentioned in the Mishnah is because the Mishnah is only mentioning nisim that lo remizu bikra klal. But there's a very obvious ha'ara in light of some of the raid that we've spoken out. There's obvious ha'ara on this Taisus Yantiv, and that is from the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon wrote a pirush on Pirkei Avos, and the Vilna Gaon's pirush on Pirkei Avos is very unique. It's not a pirush so much as it is the Vilna Gaon tracing the Mekayros, the sources from Torah Shebiksav to the Mishnayos in Pirkei Avos. So if you take a look at the Vilna Gaon, every single time the Mishnah says something, the Vilna Gaon is going to send you to a pasuk. So similar to what the Vilna Gaon did in his Bir Hagra, where the Vilna Gaon has a source from a Chazal, a Gemara, Yerushalmi, a Medrash Rabbah, Sifra, Sifri, a Teiras Kayanim, a Psikta, for a Halach and Shulchan Aruch. The Vilna Gaon did the same thing to Mishnayos. So you have a Mishnah which was written by the Tanaim, so the source is going to have to be one step back. It's going to be a source from the Torah Shebiksav. And it's Yidua that the Vilna Gaon said that the reason he did this is because Pirkei Avos is called Avos. Why is it called Avos? The first Rashi Masechtas Bava Kama. Bava Kama Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Arba Avos Nezikin. Avos Kari Lahanoch Tichsivim Bikra Behedya. The definition of Avos is something that's mefurish in the Torah. So said the Vilna Gaon, Pirkei Avos is a tifkai, classic Vilna Gaon. Avos is Kari Lahanoch Tichsivim Bikra Behedya. That means there must be a scriptural source somewhere for this Mishnah. If it's a scriptural source for the Mishnah, so the Vilna Gaon's Avodah, when he wrote his Pirush on Pirkei Avos, was to find where all the Mishnayos in Pirkei Avos are mefurish, where exactly the Chsivin Bikra Behedya. If that's the case, it's a shver Taisus Yantiv. Taisus Yantiv is saying that the Asar Nisan that I mentioned in the Mishnah over here in Pirkei and Pirkei Avos are dafka kamanil hu delay remizu bikra klal, that goes against the very essence of what Pirkei Avos is. Avos is dafka kari lahanach techsiv bikra behedya. The way the Vilna Gaon classically said. Truth is, if you take a look at the Gaon's Pirush on this Mishnah, the Gaon doesn't say anything. So every single Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, the Gaon has a scriptural source. Over here, the Gaon doesn't say anything. And it's not because the Vilna Gaon couldn't find the Makar. I'd say that's very, very highly unlikely. So the Gaon doesn't have a Makar, except for two. The last two things that I mentioned in the Mishnah, the Vilna Gaon does on a Makar. What are the last two? Hizik Nachash v'akrav b'Yerushalayim yoylam. A Nachash or an akrav was never mazik in Yerushalayim. And a person never felt imbakvemt when he was in Yerushalayim. The Yidden were the regel, said all the Jews descending upon Yerushalayim at the same time. You'd think there'd be traffic, it'd get a little uncomfortable. It was never that way. Says the Vilna Gaon on those last two, shenemar. It says Kalilas Yoifi Misois Kol Aretz. Says they're going to have a Makar. Yerushalayim is Kalilas Yoifi. It's Yoifi. It's Misois Kol Aretz. It's the happiest place in the world. If a Nachash and an Akriv would bite, if the person would sometimes feel uncomfortable, it would be a stira, it would be a contradiction to Yerushalayim being Klilas Yoifi, to Yerushalayim being Misais Kol Haaretz. So the Vilna Gaon didn't have a makar to the first 8, but the Vilna Gaon had a little bit of a remes to the last 2. But the bottom line is we have a Taisus Yantiv that says what's unique about these, the Kamandu L'Remizu B'Kra Klal, L'Chur at first glance, it's inconsistent with the Gaon who said that Pirkei Avos is Miloshen Avos, as in Rashi Bava Kama Daf Beis Amud Aleph. Avos Kar L'Hanav T'chsivim B'Kra Behedya, how could that be? It's interesting that the Gaon himself didn't seem to have one. Maybe this Mishnah is an exception to even the last 2. It's a Tzas Remes, Klilas Yoifi, Misayis Kol Haaretz. That's an interesting Nahar. But there's another pshat. If you take a look at your Yochanu Bayaz Mishnayos, there's another pshat right here, Alatar, to explain why the Mishnah mentioned 10 and not the other 8 or any other miracles that may have happened every day in the Beis HaMikdash. Says the Tiferes Yisrael, Asora Nisim Navsol Aviseinu, L'Toivas Aviseinu. You know what was unique about these 10? They were all done for Klal Yisrael. The Shar Nisim Shanasu Sham, the other miracles that happened, there were others. L'Chashav Lutana, Midloi Hoya Behem Toiva. Because those were not for Klal Yisrael. Rather, Eidus Sheshchina Shayrisha. The whole purpose of those was Eidus U'Lechalbay Yolam Shashchina Shayr B'Yisrael. So you see in this Tiferet Yisrael two beautiful things. Number one, what's unique about these 10 is Asara Nisan Naso La'aviseinu B'Mikdash. It doesn't say Asara Nisan Naso B'Beis HaMikdash. Asara Nisan Naso La'aviseinu. And the Tiferet Yisrael is being medayik. The word La'aviseinu means B'Shvil La'aviseinu, the Toivas La'aviseinu. And that's what's unique about this list. These were all things that were done for the benefit of every single Yid. It was done with Toivas Klal Yisrael. That's what's unique. There were others. The others weren't L'Toivas Aviseinu. That's why they're on the outside looking in. That's why they didn't make this cut. That's why they're not in this mission. What was then the purpose of those other miracles if they weren't L'Toivas Aviseinu? The Eidusu L'Chabay Yolam Shashchina Shayr B'Yisrael. Which means it wasn't just the Ner Maravi that was Eidus L'Chabay Yolam, but all 8 miracles that Rabbeinu Bechaya says were not mentioned in this Mishnah right over here in Pirkei Avos. You know what you saw? The reason the Klicheres were nivla into the ground. They were all Eidusu L'Chabay Yolam Shashchina Shayr B'Yisrael. Half of a fellow. Either way, that's the first part. The second ara is, so the purpose of the Ner Maravi was Eidos L'Chabay Yolam Shashchina Shayra B'Yisrael. L'chura ara. That is, the Gemara says in the Sechtes Yuma Daf Lamed Tesam and Aleph that for the 40 years that Shimon HaTzadik was Kohen Gadol during Bayis Sheni, there were miracles that happened every single day in the Beis HaMikdash. After Shimon HaTzadik was no longer Kohen Gadol, so all those miracles went away. One of the miracles that the Mishnah mentions is that the Ner Maravi was doilik. So this Ner Maravi that the Gemara talks about in Menachos Peivav Amud Beis, that the Gemara talks about in Shabbos Chav Beis Amud Beis, it existed during Bayis Rishon, and it existed for 40 years of Bayis Sheni. Which 40 years? The 40 years that Shimon HaTzadik was Kohen Gadol. But after Shimon HaTzadik was no longer Kohen Gadol, at that point, those miracles, the Ner Maravi no longer existed. But Al Kopanim, the 40 years that Shimon HaTzadik was Kohen Gadol, there was a Ner Maravi. L'chura, the Gemara says in Yuma Daf Chaf Aleph on the days that when Chagai Hanavi said Nevuah about Bayis Sheni, he said that Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to allow the Yidden to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash v'ikavda, and he's going to get kavod through Bayis Sheni. And the word v'ikavda is spelled Vav Aleph Kaf Vez Dalet. There's no hay at the end. It's chaser hay. And Chazal say the reason it's chaser hay is because there were 5 things that existed during Bayis Rishon that didn't exist during Bayis Sheni. The Gemara lists the 5 things. There's a question in the proper Girsa in the Gemara. But one of the 5 that everybody agrees is the right Girsa is Shechina. So whereas there was Shechina during Bayis Rishon, the Shechina was not Shayra in the second Beis HaMikdash. If that's the case, let's do the arithmetic. The Gemara says in Yuma Lamed Tes that there was the Ner Maravi during the 40 years of Bayis Sheni that Shimon HaTzadik was Kohen Gadol. The Gemara says in Menachos Peivav Amud Beis and in Shabbos Chav Beis Amud Beis that the whole Yesod of the Ner Maravi was Eidos L'Yischol B'Yolam Shashchina Shayr B'Yisrael. And the Gemara says in Yuma Chav Aleph Amud Beis that there was no Shechina during Bayis Sheni. Okay, it's sad. How do you reconcile these 3 Gemaras? But the Teretz is Pashut. You have to say the Shechina and the Shechina. There's different levels in Ashoris HaShechina. It's true that there was a Ner Maravi, which is Eidos L'Chabay Yolam Shashchina Shayr B'Yisrael, which suggests there was definitely Shechina during Bayis Sheni. And it's also true that one of the 5 things that were lacking from Bayis Rishon to Bayis Sheni was Shechina. Because there was Shechina, but at the same time, it was not qualitatively on the same level as the Shechina that existed during Bayis Rishon. This is a theme that we've spoken about, not recently, but over the years. V'hadvarim atikim. But just one ha'ara, ein beis medrash b'loi chiddush. I mean, this was already a chiddush, but just one other chiddush, and that is that l'chura, how could you say that there was no Shechina during Bayis Sheni? We know the Rambam Shita, the Rambam in Hilchos Beis Abchira, Perek Vav Alachat Hazayin, where the Rambam paskins Kedusha Rishayna Kitchel L'Shayta V'Lei Kitchel L'Asa Lavi as it relates to Kedusha Eretz Yisrael, but as it relates to Kedusha Yerushalayim V'Beis HaMikdash, Kedusha Rishayna Kitchel L'Shayta V'Kitchel L'Asa Lavi. So, for example, the Rambam Shita is there's no Trumas U'Maisris B'Zman Hazem Midei Raisa, but Makrivim and Afal Pishein Bayis. Etc., etc. It's all based on the fact that there's no Kedushas Eretz Yisrael as it relates to Trumas and Maisres and Bekurim and Shvias, etc. But as it relates to Kedushas Yerushalayim or Beis Hamikdash, that says the Rambam, L'chura, at first glance, what's this chilik between Kedushas Eretz Yisrael and Kedushas Yerushalayim? V'lama ani oimer b'mikdash v'Yerushalayim shekedusha rishayna kedushas and lasalavai u'b'kedusha shar Eretz Yisrael li'yid Shvias u'Maisres lo'y kitchel lasalavai. Says the Rambam, I'm going to explain it to you myself. You don't need Noisa Kalim for this. The Rambam himself explains it. Because Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash gets its Kedusha from the Shechina, and there's always Shechina. There's always Shechina. So what's going on? If there's always Shechina, then there was definitely Shechina b'Bayis Sheni. That means it's even Shechina b'Zman Hazeh. I'll ask you another question. You daven v'Yerushalayim mircha b'racham v'tashuv v'sishkaim b'soicha kasher dibarta. We're asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'sishkaim b'soicha. L'chayra, what's pshat in the tefillah v'sishkaim b'soicha? How does it do with this Rambam? The Rambam, the Perek Vav Hilchos Beis Abchira, says that the miktushas hamiktush shleim b'nei hashchina v'shchina eina b'teila. That means the shchina today. So what's this tefillah v'sishkaim b'soicha kasher dibarta? Okay, you want to tell me build a Beis Hamikdash, Matzmiach Keren Yeshua, Malchus Beis David? There's a lot of things we don't have, but Shechina, the Rambam says we do have. The Rambam says the Shechina Zeina B'Teila. How did the Rambam understand the Nusachat Bracha of Yerushalayim Mircha, which comes from the Anshe Knesses Agdela? V'sishkaim b'soicha kasher dibarta. The Teretz is there's levels of Shechina. Of course the Rambam's saying the Shechina, but the Shechina and the Shechina and the Shechina and the Shechina. So we're davening to the V'sishkaim b'soicha kasher dibarta. We want to go back to the real Shechina. But I'll call him just the second Ha'ara. The third Ha'ara, is a hashtag Meshech Chachma. Classic Meshech Chachma, I should say. And that is that we know that many of the Kelim in the Beis HaMikdash had badim. There were poles affixed to the sides of them. And the purpose of the badim was so that when the Leviim carried the Kelim of the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, they would carry it with the poles. The Shulchan had poles. The Aroin had poles, the Mizbechos had poles, etc., etc. The Gemara says in Masechtas Yuma, Daf Ayin Beis and Aleph, Hameser Badei Aroin Loika. If somebody would remove the badim of the Aroin Loika, he would get Malchus. Now that's only true for the Aron. It's not true for the Shulchan. It's not true for the Mizbeach. It's Dafka the Aron. Hameser Badei Aroin Loika. And at first glance, it's Sarach Bir. What's the reason that if somebody removes the badim for the Aron, he gets Malchus, but if somebody removes the badim of one of the other Kelim in the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash, he's not going to get Malchus. It says Ramei Simcha in Parshas Truma, I'm going to tell you Pshat, and Behektim a Rambam Shita. This is a Rambam Shita that's very important, especially as we come now closer to the sugyas that discuss the menorah. If you go through the Pesukim in Parshas Tetzava, it would seem that every single night the Kohen would light the menorah. He would have to make sure that there was enough oil to last until the morning. Rashi says long enough for the Leilei Teves, but the point is it would light the entire night. The next morning, the Kohen would come and he would be made of the Neiros. He would clean up the Neiros, he would prepare, and then at night, repeat. He would do the same thing. There was a miracle with the Ner Maravi, etc., etc. And that is the sheet of all the Rishonim, with the exception of the Rambam. The Rambam in Perek Gimel Hilchos Timidim Musafin Ve'en Kama Kohen L'Arech held a very big chiddush. The Rambam says that the Kohen used to light the menorah twice, just like he brought the Minchas Chavitin twice, and there were two times that the carbon tamid was brought. He would light the menorah twice as well. He would light the menorah at night, and he would make sure tein kimidaso that it should be me'erev ad boiker. And then in the morning, when he would be made of the neiros from the night before, he would light the menorah again. And then at night he would repeat. And the Rambam explains his shita. He says it's because I believe that the definition of hatavas aneros includes hadlaka. That meitiv doesn't just mean to clean, it also means to light. Thus, if the kohen was meitiv the neros in the morning, by definition it means he was also madlik the menorah in the morning. That is the Rambam shita. The Rashba and the Tshuva and all the Rishonim, the Chinuch, everybody's matmi on this Rambam. But that is, says Rameh, what's pshan in the Rambam? Well, but derech sichli, says Rameh Simcha, derech hamuskel, he calls it. What's Pashim Pshan in the Rambam? He says, I think Pshan in the Rambam is because the Gemara Menachos Pei Vav Amud Beis, and the Gemara Shabbos Chav Beis Amud Beis, and by the way, it's a Medrash Rab and a Medrash Tanchum in the beginning of Parshas Baloichsko, all in a different nusach if you want to look it up. It's Kedai Ayin Sham with a mashal. But the bottom line is, it says Rameh Simcha that the Gemara made a very big deal about the fact that even though there was a commandment to light the menorah, but at the same time, Lo La'ira Ani Tzarech. HaKadosh Baruch says, don't think I need you to light up my bias. That's not what this is all about. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Irish Alaylam. It's not for me, it's for you. It's for Yikrei Lecha. It's for you. It's Eidos L'chal Bay Olam. She'ashchina Shayir B'Yisrael. But it's not for me. But there would have been a Havamina, Ben Benoishal Havamina, that maybe it was for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's why we needed to do certain things to make it clear that that's not what's going on. The Shulchan is in Sof and the Menorah is in Darim. The way the windows were made. This is all to L'Haitzim Milibin Shal Tzadaykim, that nobody should think that the reason there's a Menorah is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu maybe needs the Or. Loi Iran Yitzarach, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says Ramei Simcha, maybe the Rambam held that's why they lit the menorah during the day as well. Because had the menorah only been lit at night, you would think, at night it's very dark. So at night HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs light. But during the day, that's why we don't light the menorah. So again, to be mafkia that thought that it's Lo Iran Yitzarach, said Ramei Simcha, Al Derech HaMuskal, I believe that was Pshat in the Rambam. That the Rambam took this idea of Lo Iran Yitzarach and ran with it, so to speak, and said that maybe that's the beer. Obviously, the Rambam held in Lumdis that Hatavim means Hadlaka. But at the end of the day, Al Derech HaMuskal, Meir Nevuchendig, the Rambam held that the reason there's a mitzvah to light the menorah in the morning, not just at night, is so that you shouldn't think Lo Iran Yitzarach. So it says Rameir Simcha. It's amazing how Rameir Simcha goes from here to what Rameir Simcha is about to say. That based on that, I'll explain to you why there was an idea of not to remove the Badei Aron. Because the purpose of the poles was to carry the Kalim. But Chazal say the Aron was different. The Aron was Noiseus Noisav. So it says Rameir Simcha, if there would be a halacha that the only time the poles have to be in the Aron is while you're carrying the Aron, but if you're not carrying the Aron, you can remove it like you can with the bottom of the Shulchan and the Mizbeach, people would think that the purpose of the bottom was really to carry the menorah. But really the purpose of the bottom was not to carry the menorah, because the Aron was Noiseus Noisav. So to emphasize that point, you know what the Chacham, it's a pasuk in the Torah. You're not ever allowed to remove the Badei Aron, even when you're not carrying it, to show that the purpose of the Badei Aron is not to be able to carry the Aron, because you're never carrying the Aron, but rather the purpose of the Badei Aron is that it should be there. And that's why even when you're not carrying it, the halachas is going to be like it. To emphasize this idea of the Aron Noisa is Noisa, for the same reason that the Rambam said that you light the menorah during the day, to show that it's loy Yitzarach. It's for the same reason Amesa Badei Aron Loika, to show that really her Aron is Noisa. It's Noisa. There's a fourth Aron, but let's learn a little bit Gemara. Zok the Mishnah weiter, a new parak. Shtei midos shel Yavesh hayu b'mikdash. There were two midos that were used to measure the soiles and the kemach that was going to be used for the Menachos in the Beis HaMikdash. Isaron, one was measured in Isaron, v'chatzi Isaron, the other one measured a chatzi Isaron. Meir says, Isaron, v'chatzi Isaron. There were three. Two of them measured in Isaron, and the other one measured a chatzi Isaron. The Gemara is going to explain why you needed two the size of an Isaron. What did they use with the Isaron? That's what they use all the Menachos for, right? Almost all Menachos, how much soils did you have? You had an Isaron, so you had to know how much is an Isaron. So you had this measuring cup, it went up to an Isaron, that's how you knew. If they brought a par, the Minchas Hasachan that came along with it had 3 Isroinos. If there was an aisle, it had 2 Isroinos. So you would think maybe there was a measuring cup that measured 3 Isroinos, and maybe there was a measuring cup that measured 2 Esroinos, were applicable. That's not the way it worked. It was always 1 Isaron. So if you're going to need 3 lapar, you're going to just measure 3 of them. Chatzi Isaron, what do you do with the Chatzi Isaron? That was used for the Chavita Kohen Gadol, because the Kohen Gadol's Minchas Chavita was also 1 Isaron, but he brought a Machzisa Ba'Boiker, Machzisa Ba'Erev. It's like this, you had to know what's a half and a half. So you use Mechza Ba'Boiker, Umechza Bein Rabbi. Tanya, Rameir Fleck Zugin. Ma Talmud Lamin Isaron, like Heves HaEchad. The Pasuk says, Isaron, lakeves ha'echad, l'shivas ha'kvasim. It says the word Isaron twice. There were 2 measuring cups, each one measured in Isaron. Echad gadosh, ve'echad machok. One was an Isaron if you would heap it. So if you would fill up this cup and it was heaping, you would overflow it a little bit, that's when it measured in Isaron. The other one was a little bit bigger. So the other one, if you just filled it up to the top, even without heaping it, that's when it measured in Isaron. And the purpose of both of these were for the Menachos. The one that was machok, the one that was in Isaron, if you filled it up to the top, that was used for the Chavita Kohen Gadol. And the other one was used for all the other menachos. The Chachamim said, no, you didn't need 2 measuring cups that measured in Isaron, one that was machak, one was for Gadosh, one for the Minchas Chavitin, and one for the other menachos. All there was one. Shenemar, and how did the Chachamim know? Because it says, the Isaron echad, lakeves ha'echad, l'shivas ha'kvasa. So Rameir darshan in the pasuk, Isaron lakeves ha'echad, and the Chachamim darshan in the pasuk, the Isaron echad. Isaron suggests there were 2 that measured in Isaron. Isaron echad obviously suggests that there was only one. Im Kain, so the Gemara says according to the Chachamim that there was only one. Matamud loymar Isaron. What does the Chachamim do with Rameir's pasuk? The Rabbi is Chatzi Isaron. It's coming to be marba a Chatzi Isaron. Rameir Chatzi Isaron. According to Rameir, how do you know that there was a measuring cup for Chatzi Isarin. The Chachamim use it from Isarin. The extra Isarin is coming to teach me a Chatzi Isarin. But Rameh uses Isarin to tell me there were two that measured in Isarin. So the Gemara says, Nafgalei mi v'isarin. That pasuk that the Chachamim brought, v'isarin echad, the Vav, is coming to teach me an extra measuring cup that measured a half of Yisarin. V'Rabbanan. What did the Rabbanan do with the Vav? Vav loy darshi. V'Rameir hayvi Yisarin echad lekevesa echad my avle. So they used the Vav to be marba a chatzi Yisarin. But forget the Vav. What about the pasuk? V'isarin echad lekevesa echad. What do they do with that? It sounds like one Yisarin. According to Rameir, it's not true. There was Isarin. So from the Vav, they know, Rameir knows it was also a Chatzi Isarin. But at the end of the day, the words Isarin Echad, it sounds like there was one Isarin. The Chachamim said, La Fuke, two that measured in Isarin. But Rameir says there were two that measured in Isarin. So what does Isarin Echad teach me? It's coming to teach me what the Mishnah had said, that there was none that measured two Israelites, there were none that measured three Israelites. It was Isarin Echad. Anytime you were going to need the Isarin, you're always going to use a measuring cup that measured in Isarin. So the Isarin Echad is La Fuke. There was none that measured two, there was none that measured three. Rabbanan, how do Rabbanan know that? The Rabbanan use the Isarin Echad to teach me one Isarin and not two that measured in Isarin. They can't use it then, La Fuke. You didn't have a measuring cup that measured two and a measuring cup that measured three. So how then do the Rabbanan know that there was no two and there was no three? Nafkalahu min nekudai. They learn it from the Pintala. The Tanya learned to the Brayso. Rabbi Yosi, Lot Menachos Vav, Shebe Emtza Yisarin. The Pintala, a little dot in your Sefer Torah, and the Vav in the middle of the word Isaroin shall Isaroin Rishon shall Yantav Rishon. When it's describing the Nesachim of the first day shall Chag of Sukkot, there's a little dot there. So what does that come to teach me? Shelo Yimdoid Loy B'Shal Gimel Apar V'Loy B'Shal Shnayim La'ayil. It's learned out from the dot. V'Rameya, what does Rameya you learn from that dot? Nikud Elay Darish, nothing. He didn't darshan the Nikud. Chatzi Yisar Mahayim Mashamish Shabo Hayim Moeded L'Chavita Kohen Gadol. So the Mishnah said that there were measuring cups that measured in Yisar. According to Rabbanan 1, and according to Rameir 2. There were no measuring cups that measured 2 Yisraelis, even though sometimes you needed to. For example, if you were bringing an aisle. There were no measuring cups that measured 3, even though sometimes you need 3. For example, if you're bringing a par. All there was one that measured in Isarim, one according to the Chachamim, 2 according to Rameir. What's the difference between the 2 according to Rameir? One you would have to heap in order to get the Isarim, the other one, even if it was Machuk, you would get the Isarim. There was also a measuring cup that measured a Chatzi Isarim. What was the purpose of that? So the Mishnah said, Shabai hayamoided lechavite kohen gadol, because the Minchas Chavitin wasn't Isarim, but it was brought in 2 halves, Machzisa b'abayik and Machzisa b'erev. So it was used to measure the 2 halves. Right? The Gemara moided, they measured half the Minchas Chavita b'ramini, Chavite kohen gadol leheibam chatzayin. You weren't allowed to bring the Minchas Chavit and Chatzon. Ella, maybe Yisarin Shalim. What you had to do was you had to bring a complete Yisarin, v'chaytzeyu, and then divide it into 2. So what do you mean you measured the half of Yisarin? You never measured the half of Yisarin. What you did was you measured an Yisarin, and then you divided it into 2. So why are you being moeded the Chatz Yisarin? So Amar Rav Sheish says, my moeded not mechal. You're right, wrong word. It doesn't mean moeded. It means mechalik. It means they would divide the Yisarin by having these 2 cups, each of which was a half Yisarin. But the point, you're not measuring the half Yisarin, because when you're on the measuring level, you're doing it with the Yisarin. But you take the Yisarin, now have to divide it into 2. How do you know to divide it into equal halves? Because you had a measuring cup, each one of which measured a Chatz Yisarin. So Rameir said there were 2 midos that measured in Yisarin. One was Gadosh, one measured in Yisarin if he was heaping, the other one was Machuk. What about the Rameir's Chatzi Yisarin? Did it measure a Chatzi Yisarin if it was Gadosh, or did it measure a Chatzi Yisarin if it was Machuk? So Rav Chizda asked Rabbi Barchama, why are you only asking me according to Rameir? Why aren't you bothered with the Rabbanan? He said, the Rabbanan Yisarin, Guvakami Bayilahum. Gadosh Haya Machuk. The Rabbanan, it's a whole different shmooze. Because the Rabbanan, I don't even know if the Yisarin Midah was Machuk or Gadosh. That's not my question. I'm asking Rameir. Rameir, who already said that you needed 2 different Yisraelis for the
one that measured in Isarin. One was Machuk, one was Gadish. So I want to know right now, we'll talk about Rabban, but according to Rab Meir, right now, was that Machuk or was that Gadish? Amalei, Rav Chizda told Rami Bar Chama, Mid Rab Meir, Nishmal Rab Meir, Mid Rab Meir, Nishmal Rabban. What does that mean? Midam Rab Meir, Isarin, Machuk, being that Rab Meir said that the Isarin that was used for the Minchas Chavitin was Machuk, so it makes sense that the Chatzi Isarin Nami Machuk. Because what was the Chatzi Isarin used for? Also for the Minchas Chavitin. So if the Isarin Midah in Rameir's world was the one that was Machuk when being used for the Minchas Chavitin, then it makes sense that the Chatzi Isarin should also be Machuk. And Mid Rameir Machuk, Rabbanan Nami Machuk. So if the Chatzi Isarin according to Rameir was Machuk, it certainly makes sense that the Chatzi Isarin according to Rabbanan would be Machuk as well. He asked him another shayla. Chavite Kohen Gadol b'ma michalkam. Exactly how did they divide the Chavite Kohen Gadol l'chalois biyad oy b'kli? So the Minchas Chavitin ended up being 12 chalas, and they had to be equal. The question is, when they're dividing each individual chala, so you have two halves, each half is going to create 6 chalas. But the question is, you have to make, ideally, equal size chalas. Now, that's really part of the shayla. Do you have to have equal size chalas? Because if you have to have equal size chalas, you're going to have to have a mechanism of how you're going to measure it to make sure that each one is going to be equal. And that was the shayla. They do it biyad ubekli. And really the underlying shayla was, if it's being done biyad, it means it could be be'erich, it could be approximate. If it's being done with a kli, that would suggest that it has to be done a little bit more precise. So Rav Chizda said, Pshita de biyad, the ibe kli, because if it's a kli, turtin yachnes, what kind of keli are you going to bring? I mean, you can't just bring a keli into the Beis HaMikdash, chulam bazar maybe, but it's not so simple to just bring a keli into the Beis HaMikdash. So we had the kelim that we know. We had the midas, the isarin, the chatzi isar, but we don't have a midah to start measuring now each individual challah to make sure that they're the same size. The only thing you can think of is bring in a scale. And maybe weigh each chalas like this. You'll make sure each little bukala is the same size. But turtini yachnis, right? The Gemara says, why not the yachnis? Why can't you bring a scale? Why can't it become a klisharis? Bring it into the azara. So the Gemara says, kim in the beklol ksiv lav eirach. Because there's a pasuk in the Teichacha that talks about how there's going to be so little bread that they're going to have to take the crumbs and they're going to weigh it on a scale. So like this, they'll be able to have what to eat. So the turtini is mentioned, the scale is mentioned in a pasuk in the Teichacha in the context of klal. We don't want to bring a davish or klal into the Beis HaMikdash. So Rav Chizda said it must be that they didn't use a kli, they used the yad, and even though it's going to be very hard, the yad, to figure it out precisely, it's not a problem. Another shayla. We know that the shulchan had on it, obviously the lechem apanim, the yid beis chalas, but it also had the shnei beziche levayna. Now the beziche levayna were in bezichen. They were inside spoons. So you had levayna, it was inside a spoon. The levayna was to the lechem apanim, what the kaimitz was to the mincha, what the dam was to the carbon. It would eventually go on the mizbech. It would be mat to the lechem apanim achila. How did the levayna get its kedusha? Obviously, if it's going to go on the mizbech and it needs kedusha, how did it get its kedusha? From the bezicha levayna. Rabbi Bacham asked Rav Chizda another shayla. What if the levayna was put directly on the shulchan? Could the shulchan be mekadesh the levayna? Or could it not be Mekadesh the Levayna? Maushi Yekadesh Kematzim Begoidesh Shalai. Maybe Mekadesh Lechem, being that the Shulchan was able to be Mekadesh Lechem, Kematzim not Mekadesh, maybe it can be Mekadesh the Levayna as well. Or you do, but the Chazli Mekadesh, Mekadesh Lechem, because that's where the Lechem belongs. But it can't be Mekadesh the Levayna, because it's not where the Levayna belongs. Amalei, he told him, Ain't Mekadesh. It can't be Mekadesh. Fake the Gemara Eini is that so? Rabbi Yochanan said, so we'll see more about this later on, the Kamon Daf Tzadik Vav, I am in Mesiras Hashas. So we're going to get to these Gemaras, the Gemaras that talk about some of the specifics of the Lechem Apanim. But, we're all familiar somewhat with the picture. The breads, they were folded up on the sides, right? They were like, you had these two sides, and there's a machlokes in the Gemara, how tall those walls on this that you made from the chalas were. So Rabbi Yochanan said like this. According to Manama that says, it was Tvachayim Mechza, it was 2.5 Tvachim. Nimsa, it comes out, Shulchan Mekadesh Chamisha Satafach, that the Shulchan had an ability to be Mekadesh 15 Tvachim high. Why? Because each side of the shulchan had 6 chalis. Yud beis, it was 6 and 6. Each one is 2.5 tfachim. 6 times 2.5 is 15. So it comes out Rabbi Yochanan said, according to Mandama that says that the kaifel, the fold, was 2.5 tfachim. The shulchan had an ability to be mekadesh up to 15 tfachim. The divrei omer tfachayim kaifel. According to Mandama that says that they folded only 2 tfachim. Nimsa shulchan mekadesh yud beis tefach l'mayla. It was only 12 tfachim l'mayla. Now, Tainid Rav Chizda, what exactly was Rabbi Yochanan trying to say? We know the shulchan was mekadesh the lechem. So Rabbi Yechon is doing the math for us that the lechem that everybody knows the shulchan was mekadesh. According to one man number, you see it can be mekadesh lechem up to 15 tvachim. According to the other man number, it's been mekadesh up to 12 tvachim. My kamashmalan. We know that. There's no chiddush in what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Rabbi Yochanan is doing the math for us, but we don't need help with the math. Rabbi Yochanan must be saying a chiddush. Says Rav Chizkiah, you know what Rabbi Yochanan must be saying? That from the lechem aponim we can learn that the shulchan had an ability to mekadesh other things, up to 15 tfachim and up to 12 tfachim. Lemarke de islay or lemarke de islay. What's the other thing? It must be the Levina. So l'chur you have a mefurish raya from Rabbi Yochanan. The Rabbi Yochanan holds that the shulchan can be mekadesh not only the lechem aponim, but it can be mekadesh the levayin as well. This is a kasha. This was an eini on what Rav Chizda said. Again, Rami Bar Chama asked Rav Chizda whether the shulchan had an ability to mekadesh the levayin. So he told him no. The chazile mekadesh, the chazile ain't mekadesh. Says the Gemara, what do you mean eini? What did Rabbi Yochanan mean when he said the shulchan can be mekadesh up to 12 tvachim or 15 tvachim? Probably something else, which must be the levayin. So the Gemara says, Amalei, no, eini mekadesh likarv and mekadesh lipasal. We know that not all kedushas were created equally. There's kedusha and there's kedusha. Sometimes you find kedusha as it relates to it's kaddish enough that you can actually put it on the mizbech. Sometimes you find that it's not kaddish enough that you can put it on the mizbech, but it's kaddish enough that it can become pasul. It can be nifsal belina, it can be nifsal yaitzi. Rabbi Yochanan, you're right. We're saying a chiddush at the shulchan can be mekadesh something other than the lechem upon him, but that means it's kaddish li pasul. As it relates to Rami Bar Chama Shaila, he wanted to know if the levina was put on the shulchan. Can I now take the levina and put it on the mizbech? That's already a whole different story. That's kaddish likarev. It cannot be kaddish likarev. We will stop here.